I stood silently amidst the thick clouds of expensive cigar smoke in the opulent VIP poker room at the Wynn, watching my older brother try so desperately to assert his dominance before the city's most powerful investment partners. For 5 years, Claude had curated this image of the visionary CEO, relegating me to the shadows of our family's Nevada real estate empire, treating me like an inconvenient liability. He glanced up, offering that familiar condescending smirk, before gesturing vaguely toward the heavy oak doors. Irene, this is a closed session for partners. Only we are discussing multi-million-dollar acquisitions, not managing your domestic hobbies. So please leave now before you further embarrass yourself in front of my board. He paused, allowing the ripple of laughter from his inner circle to fill the space, relishing the moment of public humiliation he had so carefully orchestrated. I maintained absolute composure, walking slowly toward the mahogany table while retrieving the red velvet folio from my bag, ensuring every pair of eyes was now locked directly onto me. Claude's face paled when he recognized the legal stamp, his arrogance instantly replaced by a flash of genuine, suffocating panic. "Leave right now, or I will prove you haven't contributed a single dime to this company," Claude hissed, leaning over the table, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. I simply smiled, tapping the specific clause on the signature page of the unredacted proxy agreement. "You are only CEO because I allow it, Claude. Perhaps you should tell your board, who secretly holds 68% of the non-voting stock in this corporation." The heavy silver gavel fell echoing off the mahogany walls, a sharp crack, breaking through the chorus of mocking laughter. They thought they had finally ruined her, believing the woman in the simple beige coat was powerless, entirely destroyed by their calculated betrayals. They were wrong. As the trap snapped shut, Irene only adjusted her cuff, a cold smile finally touching her lips. Subscribe to the channel right now to witness Irene's absolute decimation of the family that betrayed her, ensuring you never miss a single moment of this incredible, high-stakes takedown. Everything began 6 months ago, when the mounting pressure from the board of directors caused Claude to finally reveal his true nature of greed and selfishness. We were gathered in the expansive mahogany-paneled library of our family estate, a room that usually held the warmth of my childhood memories, but now felt as cold as a corporate tomb. Claude stood by the fireplace with a thick legal folder in his hand, looking at me not as a sister, but as a hurdle that needed to be cleared from his path to absolute power. My father sat in his favorite leather armchair, staring into the flickering flames while choosing to remain silent, which was his way of endorsing Claude's aggressive maneuvers. Claude didn't waste any time with pleasantries, slamming the heavy folder onto the coffee table between us, while his eyes burned with an unsettling mix of ambition and disdain. He argued with a practiced, sharp tone that I lacked the necessary business intuition to handle the volatile real estate market of Nevada. According to his skewed logic, my conservative approach to our family's assets was merely hindering his bold, high-risk expansion plans that he believed would define his legacy. He spoke about me as if I were a ghost in the room, a decorative piece of the family tree that had no business touching the inner workings of a multi-billion-dollar empire. My father finally looked up, his expression unreadable, yet he nodded slowly when Claude claimed that the future of the Vance legacy rested solely on a singular, decisive leader. The betrayal stung more because of my father's quiet complicity, yet I kept my face an emotionless mask, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing my pain. Claude leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper, while he pushed a gold fountain pen toward my hand. "Sign this, Irene. You aren't suited for these dry, dusty numbers, so just take this cash settlement and go live your quiet, comfortable life elsewhere." He offered me a one-time payout that was a mere fraction of my true inheritance, coupled with an old luxury sedan that he clearly thought was more than I deserved. I looked at the document, realizing this was the moment they officially cast me out, treating me like a parasitic employee rather than a co-owner of our bloodline's hard work. Instead of arguing or demanding a seat at the table they had already barricaded, I picked up the pen with a steady hand that surprised even Claude. I knew that fighting them now would only lead to a long, messy legal battle that I wasn't quite ready to win on their terms. I spent a few minutes carefully reviewing the fine print, making sure to discreetly insert a specific complex legal clause regarding the mutual release of all personal asset guarantees. This tiny, overlooked sentence ensured that while I gave up my management rights, I was also legally decoupled from any of the catastrophic debts Claude was about to incur. They were so blinded by their eagerness to see me gone that they didn't even bother to have their lawyers scrutinize my minor handwritten additions. After the ink dried, I stood up and walked out of that house without looking back, leaving behind the only life I had ever known for an uncertain, quiet future. A few blocks away, parked under the shade of an old oak tree, a sleek black SUV was waiting for me with its engine idling patiently. Inside sat the person who would help me turn this humiliating exit into a calculated, devastating counter-strike. My financial advisor Quinn looked at me through the rearview mirror with an expression of grim professionalism while I handed over the signed copies of the agreement. Quinn had been working in the shadows for months, monitoring the erratic financial shifts within our family's subsidiary companies under my secret instructions. The signatures are valid, so we can officially begin the phase of acquiring the company's distressed debt. Now, Quinn stated while tapping a sequence of commands into a high-end encrypted tablet. I leaned back into the plush leather seat, feeling the first real spark of cold, predatory clarity since the meeting began. Claude believed he had finally removed the thorn in his side, but he had actually just handed me the freedom to operate without any familial loyalty holding me back. While he prepared to celebrate his hollow victory with expensive champagne, Quinn and I were already mapping out the acquisition of every overdue loan that kept his empire afloat. 4 months before the actual financial catastrophe struck, Claude had effectively begun digging his own grave through a series of reckless withdrawal decisions from our corporate contingency funds. He had developed a dangerous habit of treating the company's treasury as his personal piggy bank to cover mounting investment losses, along with his increasingly lavish weekend trips to Las Vegas. Every time the internal auditors raised a red flag about the disappearing liquidity, Claude would use his executive authority to silence them, claiming that these expenditures were necessary for high-level networking. He believed that his position was entirely untouchable, unaware that every signed withdrawal slip was being meticulously documented and forwarded to me by Quinn's informants within the accounting department. The situation was further aggravated by the constant social pressure from my sister-in-law Esther, who seemed obsessed with flaunting the newfound power Claude had seized from me. Esther was a woman who measured success by the rarity of her jewelry and the exclusivity of her social circle, constantly pushing Claude to upgrade their lifestyle to prove their superiority. She orchestrated extravagant galas at their new estate, ensuring that the local elite witnessed their transition from mere heirs to the absolute rulers of the Vance Empire. During one of these events, I watched from a distance as Esther toasted to their success, while wearing a diamond necklace that likely cost the equivalent of a mid-sized subsidiary's annual marketing budget. She once pulled Claude aside within earshot of several board members, whispering loud enough for me to hear that they were finally living the life they truly deserved, without any dead weight holding them back. Claude's arrogance grew in tandem with Esther's demands, leading him to ignore the severe violations of our primary bank loan covenants that Quinn began reporting to me in chilling detail. My advisor sat across from me in a quiet, nondescript office, presenting a comprehensive dossier that highlighted how Claude's mismanagement was triggering automatic debt acceleration clauses. The banks were becoming increasingly nervous about the sudden volatility in our cash flow, yet Claude remained blissfully ignorant of the predatory interest rates he was agreeing to just to maintain his facade. Quinn pointed out that our family's main holding company was now teetering on the edge of a total debt recall, which would provide the perfect opportunity for an outside entity to intervene. I realized then that Claude's desperation to look powerful was exactly what would make him vulnerable to the financial trap I was carefully preparing with Quinn's assistance. Instead of warning the family or attempting to salvage the sinking ship, I instructed Quinn to initiate the acquisition of these distressed debts through a network of anonymous shell companies. We spent weeks negotiating with the frustrated bankers who were eager to offload the Vance Industries risk, effectively allowing us to become Claude's primary creditors without his knowledge. While Claude was busy approving luxury renovations for his private office, Quinn was busy ensuring that every overdue interest payment was now owed directly to an entity under my absolute control. We also began a quiet campaign to gather the floating shares from minority investors who had become disillusioned by Claude's erratic leadership and the company's declining market valuation. Each transaction was executed with surgical precision, slowly elevating my stake in the corporation until I held the silent majority required to eventually seize total control. Claude continued to operate under the delusion that he had successfully outmaneuvered me, often making condescending remarks about my lack of ambition during our rare family dinners. He would lean back in his chair, swirling an expensive vintage wine while Esther smiled knowingly beside him, both of them convinced that my silence was a sign of total defeat. During one particular evening, after I had politely questioned a recent dip in our quarterly projections, Claude dismissed my concerns with a sharp, dismissive laugh that echoed through the dining room. "Don't worry about Irene. She is just an outsider with no voice. Now we are the true masters of this empire," Claude declared while glancing at our father to ensure his dominance was acknowledged. I merely nodded in response, hiding the fact that I had just authorized Quinn to trigger a formal default notice that would be delivered to his office the following morning. 8 weeks later, the financial foundation of Vance Industries began to tremble violently as our major partners simultaneously demanded the immediate repayment of their outstanding capital. The major banks suddenly tightened their credit lines, forcing Claude into a desperate state of frozen assets, where he could no longer afford to pay the salaries of our high-level executive team. This sudden liquidity crisis sent shockwaves through the corporate headquarters, stripping away the thin veneer of stability that Claude had tried so hard to maintain since my departure. He spent his days locked in the executive suite, staring at spreadsheets that offered no solutions, while the prestige of our family name began to erode in the eyes of the public. The silence from the boardrooms was deafening, leaving Claude to face the consequences of his arrogance without the safety net he had always taken for granted. Claude made several frantic attempts to seek support from various venture capital firms, but he was entirely unaware that every single one of those entities was secretly under my covert control. He pitched desperate expansion plans and offered inflated projections to investors who were actually reporting directly to me through Quinn's secure communication channels. Each rejection he received was a calculated move designed to further isolate him, stripping away his remaining options until he was backed into a corner with nowhere left to turn. I watched from the shadows as my brother's confidence crumbled, replaced by a frantic energy that made him prone to making even more catastrophic errors in judgment. He was looking for a savior in a market that had already been rigged against him, yet his ego prevented him from seeing the pattern behind his consistent failures. The social facade also began to fracture, as Esther realized that their glamorous life of luxury was rapidly disintegrating beneath the weight of unpaid debts. She transitioned from being Claude's most vocal supporter to his harshest critic, openly mocking his inability to secure the funding necessary to maintain their extravagant social standing. Esther's panic was palpable during their private arguments, which Quinn's sources described as increasingly volatile and centered around her refusal to accept any reduction in their lifestyle. She pointed out his failure to handle the very empire he had fought so hard to steal, claiming that his incompetence was dragging the entire family into public disgrace. The woman who had once toasted to their shared victory was now the first to highlight the cracks in his leadership, further destabilizing Claude's fragile mental state. Quinn eventually stepped in to work directly with Claude's legal team, presenting a lifeline in the form of a massive financial support package from a mysterious entity known as the Obsidian Fund. My advisor delivered the offer with a cold, professional detachment, outlining a series of complex conditions that required Claude to put up his remaining voting shares as collateral. The terms were intentionally predatory, hidden beneath layers of sophisticated legal jargon that promised immediate liquidity in exchange for future control of the corporation. Claude's lawyers were exhausted and overwhelmed by the mounting lawsuits, leading them to miss the subtle traps embedded within the fine print of the Obsidian Agreement. They saw the fund as their only hope for survival, failing to realize that they were inviting the very person they had betrayed back into the heart of the company. I stood behind a wall of monitors in Quinn's secure facility, watching through a remote feed as Claude finally sat down to sign the new loan documents. There was a profound sense of irony in seeing him pick up the same gold fountain pen he had used to cast me out months ago now, using it to sign away the very power he had cherished. He hesitated for a brief second before scrawling his signature across the bottom of the final page, effectively handing over the keys to the kingdom without knowing the identity of his new benefactor. Claude looked relieved as he handed the folder back to Quinn's representatives, believing he had just bought himself enough time to rebuild his shattered reputation. He even managed a weak, triumphant smile toward Esther, who was waiting in the hallway to see if their lifestyle had been salvaged for another month. "We need this loan from the Obsidian Fund at all costs, otherwise the entire corporation will officially be bankrupt by the end of this month," Claude stated to his legal team while he leaned heavily against the mahogany desk. His voice lacked the booming authority it once possessed, sounding more like a defeated man clinging to a piece of driftwood in a stormy sea. He had no idea that every dollar he was about to receive was a tether that would eventually pull him down once I decided to tighten the knot. The isolation Claude felt on the trading floor was now absolute, as not a single independent investor was willing to touch the wreckage he had created. I watched him pour a drink with trembling hands, realizing that the man who had once mocked my lack of ambition was now a mere tenant in his own empire. 3 weeks before the decisive showdown took place in Las Vegas, Claude had placed his final hopes on a high-stakes personal asset mortgage agreement that effectively sealed his fate. He was forced to bring forth every remaining preferred share belonging to our family legacy to serve as collateral for a massive predatory emergency loan. This desperate move was his last attempt to keep the company's creditors at bay, yet he failed to realize that the terms were meticulously designed to strip him of his remaining authority. Claude spent hours in his office reviewing the documents with a frantic energy, his hands trembling as he realized the sheer scale of the risk he was taking with our family's future. He believed that this influx of capital would buy him enough time to execute one final brilliant maneuver to save his crumbling reputation. Quinn contacted me immediately after the signatures were finalized, confirming that the legal transfer of those critical shares to my silent holding fund was now complete and irrevocable. My financial advisor had spent weeks coordinating with the lenders to ensure that every clause in the mortgage agreement served my ultimate goal of total corporate reclamation. We now possessed the legal leverage required to dismantle Claude's leadership at a moment's notice, yet we chose to wait for the perfect theater to reveal our hand. Quinn's meticulous attention to the legal fine print ensured that Claude had voluntarily signed away his future voting rights in the event of even a minor technical default. The trap was now fully armed, waiting only for the inevitable moment when Claude's desperation would lead him to trigger the final mechanism of his own destruction. Claude remained entirely deluded about the reality of his situation, genuinely believing that winning a high-stakes poker game at an exclusive Vegas casino could resolve his short-term financial crisis. He began to display an increasing level of aggression toward everyone in his social and professional circle, treating loyal employees with a level of contempt that bordered on madness. My brother's ego had expanded to fill the void left by his failing business sense, leading him to dismiss any cautious advice as a sign of weakness or disloyalty. He walked through the corporate corridors with a predatory swagger, barking orders and making unrealistic demands that only further alienated the remaining members of the board. I watched from a safe distance as his mental stability began to fracture under the immense weight of the lies he had told himself and the family. The loan agreement itself was a masterpiece of financial deception, structured in a way that forced Claude to unknowingly forfeit his primary decision-making power at the upcoming shareholder meeting. He was so focused on the immediate cash infusion that he overlooked the covenants that prohibited him from exercising his voting block, while the emergency debt remained outstanding. Claude was essentially walking into an ambush with his eyes wide open, fueled by a toxic combination of vanity and the misplaced belief that he was still the smartest person in the room. He spoke frequently about his impending trip to Las Vegas, viewing the casino floor as the place where he would reclaim his status as a legendary high-stakes player. He had no suspicion that the very entity providing his life support was actually the sister he had once discarded like a piece of useless office furniture. While Claude prepared for his gambling excursion, I spent my time with Quinn, finalizing a comprehensive dossier that documented every single instance of his fraudulent financial activities. We had gathered undeniable proof of his commingling of personal and corporate funds, including the unauthorized transfers he had made to cover his private betting debts. This evidence was not merely meant for a boardroom discussion, but was prepared as a legal weapon to ensure that Claude's exit from the company would be both absolute and deeply humiliating. I reviewed the bank statements and forged internal memos one last time, feeling a cold sense of justice as I realized that Claude's own greed had provided me with everything I needed to destroy his public image. Every decision he had made to protect his fragile ego had left a paper trail that led directly back to his absolute betrayal of our father's legacy. This is the final bet, and as soon as I win this game, I will take back everything and kick out those people who are constantly eyeing my company," Claude declared while slamming his suitcase shut in the hallway. He looked at me with a sneer of triumph, convinced that his secret plan was flawless and that he was about to become untouchable once again. I remained silent, offering him a polite nod that he likely interpreted as a sign of my continued submission to his superior intellect. He had no idea that the table he was about to sit at was already owned by me, and that every card dealt would be part of a sequence I had orchestrated months ago. Claude left for Las Vegas believing he was a king on a mission, unaware that he was actually a pawn, whose usefulness had finally reached its expiration date. The final night before everything came to a decisive conclusion, the atmosphere in the sprawling lobby of the Las Vegas luxury hotel became suffocatingly thick with hidden agendas. Claude had officially lost all forms of personal liquidity, reaching a point where he could no longer afford to pay the basic service invoices at the high-end establishment where he was staying. He had spent the previous several hours attempting to use his corporate credit cards for minor expenses, only to have each transaction declined by the hotel's front desk staff. This public display of financial incompetence was a far cry from the image of the unstoppable titan he had spent years carefully constructing for the world to see. He remained huddled in a corner of the private lounge, staring at his silent phone, as if expecting a miracle to fall from the neon-lit sky of the Nevada desert. The man who had once commanded rooms with a single glance was now reduced to a nervous guest who was essentially being held captive by his own mounting debts. While Claude was struggling with his immediate insolvency, Esther was becoming increasingly desperate as she realized that their social standing was about to vanish forever. She spent the better part of the evening trying to convince Claude to pack their remaining designer luggage and flee the city with whatever jewelry she had left in her possession. Esther believed that they could start over in a different jurisdiction before the creditors officially filed for a total asset seizure against their personal holdings. However, her plan for a quick escape was quietly neutralized from a distance by my anonymous security detail that had been monitoring their every movement since they arrived. Every exit was subtly blocked by professional staff who ensured that Claude remained in the city to face the consequences of the legal documents he had previously signed. Esther's panic grew as she realized that the walls were closing in, yet she still refused to acknowledge her own role in encouraging Claude's reckless behavior. Quinn contacted me during the early hours of the morning to confirm that the final audit of the corporation's asset portfolio had been successfully completed under my secret authority. My advisor verified that I now held official legal control over 68% of the company through the network of holding funds we had established. This confirmation meant that the transition of power was no longer just a possibility, but a legal reality that only required a formal announcement to become effective. Quinn had meticulously tracked every dollar Claude had diverted, ensuring that we had a complete paper trail to present to the board members at the upcoming meeting. We were now standing on the precipice of a total corporate reclamation, waiting only for the sun to rise so we could execute the final phase of our high-stakes strategy. I felt a cold sense of calm as I reviewed the digital files, knowing that the years of being underestimated by my own family were finally coming to an end. I moved quietly through the casino floor later that night, maintaining a low profile while I observed the preparation for the meeting that Claude believed would be his salvation. He was under the impression that the upcoming session was merely a formal signing ceremony with the mysterious strategic partner from the Obsidian Fund. Claude had spent his last few dollars on a premium pressing service for his most expensive bespoke suit, desperately trying to hide the financial decay that was rotting his empire from the inside. He believed that coating himself in luxury would be enough to distract the investors from the massive losses he had incurred during his tenure as CEO. My brother was still clinging to the hope that a single signature would erase his failures, entirely unaware that the person he was waiting for was the very sister he had discarded. I watched him from the shadows of a nearby marble pillar, seeing the frantic way he adjusted his tie while he rehearsed his speech for the following morning. The layout of the financial trap was now perfectly locked, with every legal exit for Claude officially obstructed by the very covenants he had signed in his moments of desperation. My legal team had ensured that the emergency loan agreements included a clause that triggered an immediate change in management upon any further evidence of fiscal fraud. Claude had unknowingly handed me the keys to his own destruction when he attempted to cover his gambling debts with corporate funds, providing us with the final piece of evidence we needed. Not a single independent law firm or investor in the city would touch him now, as his reputation had been quietly dismantled by the information Quinn had disseminated through the proper channels. Claude was walking into a boardroom that had already been reorganized against him, yet he still managed to maintain a facade of arrogant confidence as he spoke to his remaining associates. "Tomorrow everything will finally end. The partner from Obsidian will be here, and I will once again be the king of this corporation," Claude stated while he leaned against the gold-trimmed bar in the VIP lounge. His voice carried a hollow ring of desperation that he tried to mask with a forced laugh, though the people around him seemed increasingly uncomfortable with his presence. He took a long drink from a crystal glass, convinced that his secret maneuver had worked and that he was about to become untouchable in the eyes of the family. I remained in the background, a silent observer of his final hours of power, feeling no pity for the man who had shown me none when I was at my most vulnerable. Claude believed he was preparing for a coronation, unaware that he was actually heading toward a public execution of his professional life that would leave him with absolutely nothing. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, the VIP poker room transformed into a true battlefield where Claude's desperate dreams officially dissolved into a cloud of bitter smoke. He stood in the center of the opulent space holding a crystal glass while delivering a grandiose speech about the imminent rebirth of the Vance Empire under his visionary leadership. The room was filled with skeptical investors and elite power brokers who had been witnessing the slow decay of our family's reputation over the previous several months. Claude spoke with a forced booming authority, claiming that a massive strategic partnership was about to restore the company's liquidity and silence all of his critics forever. He gestured toward the mahogany table as if he were a king about to sign a treaty of victory, unaware that the very foundation of his chair was being pulled out from beneath him. Every word he uttered was a testament to his unchecked arrogance, creating a sharp contrast with the cold reality of the legal documents waiting in my velvet folio. My sudden entrance into the room immediately disrupted Claude's self-indulgent monologue, causing a wave of murmurs to ripple through the gathered elite. Claude turned toward me with a face contorted by sudden rage, his eyes flashing with a mixture of contempt and embarrassment at my unexpected presence. He marched toward me while signaling for the private security guards to intervene, shouting that this was a private executive session where I had absolutely no legal standing. My brother was so consumed by his need to maintain control that he failed to notice the calm, predatory expression on the faces of my accompanying legal team. He believed that a simple show of force would be enough to expel me from the room, yet he was about to realize that his commands no longer carried any weight in this building. I stood my ground as the guards hesitated, their eyes darting between the current CEO and the formidable group of attorneys standing silently behind me. Do you really think that having a few spare pennies allows you to sit at the same table as me now? Look at yourself, you were cast out of this family a long time ago. Claude sneered while he pointed a trembling finger toward the exit. I responded by slowly opening the folio and placing the unredacted Obsidian Fund agreements onto the central table for everyone in the room to witness. I began to publicly state the evidence regarding how Claude had secretly mortgaged every single family share to secure emergency loans from an entity he didn't understand. The room fell into a deathly silence as the investors realized that the strategic partner Claude had been boasting about was actually a hostile creditor holding his entire future in its hands. I looked directly into Claude's eyes, watching as the first realization of his catastrophic mistake began to seep through his mask of arrogant confidence. The shock on Claude's face became truly visible when Quinn entered the room, carrying the finalized shareholder ledger that had been updated just minutes prior. My advisor moved with a chilling efficiency, distributing copies of the certified ownership certificates that officially confirmed my 68% stake in the parent corporation. Claude's crystal glass nearly slipped from his hand as he stared at the documents, his brain seemingly unable to compute the fact that I was the ultimate beneficiary of the Obsidian Fund. He turned toward our father, who was sitting in the corner with a look of profound disappointment, hoping for a final intervention that would never come. Dad merely looked away, realizing that his favored son had successfully gambled away the entire family legacy in a futile attempt to prove his superiority. Quinn's presence was the final signal that the transition of power was complete, leaving Claude standing alone in a room full of people who were now witnessing his total professional execution. Claude made a frantic, pathetic attempt to deny the legal validity of the contracts, claiming that I had used fraudulent means to manipulate the company's debt structure. My legal team quickly shut down his desperate arguments by presenting a mountain of undeniable evidence, including the very documents Claude had signed with his own hand. Each signature he had scrawled in his moments of greed was now a nail in the coffin of his career, proving that he had voluntarily forfeited his rights in exchange for temporary cash. The attorneys highlighted the clauses regarding fiscal fraud and the unauthorized commingling of personal funds, which triggered the immediate termination of his executive contract. Claude looked around the room for a single ally, yet every person who had previously laughed at his jokes was now staring at him with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. The total collapse of Claude's authority was finalized right there in the heart of the Las Vegas elite, as Quinn officially moved to call for an emergency vote to buy Niem the CEO. Not a single person in the room raised their hand to support my brother, leaving him legally destitute and professionally ruined before the very partners he had tried to impress. Claude's knees seemed to buckle under the immense weight of his defeat, his bespoke suit now looking like a borrowed costume on a man who had lost everything. He was no longer the king of the corporation, but a mere trespasser in a room that was now entirely under my command. I watched him sink into a chair, realizing that the man who had once mocked my quiet nature was now the one who had been silenced by his own monstrous ego. The glittering lights of Las Vegas slowly faded as the first rays of dawn began to break over the desert horizon, marking the definitive end of a greedy era and the beginning of a new sense of justice. Claude was officially removed from his position as CEO and forced to exit the corporate headquarters in total silence while being ignored by the very employees he had once treated with such blatant disregard. There was no grand farewell or sympathetic parting words from the staff, only the cold professional indifference of a team that had already recognized their new leadership. I watched from the balcony of the executive suite as my brother walked toward the parking lot carrying a single cardboard box that contained the remaining fragments of his former professional life. He looked smaller than I had ever remembered, his shoulders slumped under the heavy realization that his tenure as the family's golden child had finally reached its expiration date. The man who had once believed he was the architect of our future was now just a stranger walking away from the empire he had nearly destroyed. The social fallout was equally swift and merciless, as Esther chose to abandon Claude almost immediately once she realized that her husband no longer possessed any remaining social or financial utility. She had spent the previous several hours frantically packing whatever designer items and jewelry she could carry before the official asset seizure orders were implemented against their personal residence. Esther did not offer Claude any words of comfort or loyalty, instead choosing to blame him entirely for the public humiliation that had stripped her of her elite standing in the community. She was gone before the sun had fully risen, leaving Claude to face the mounting legal consequences of his actions without the partner who had encouraged his most reckless ambitions. It was a chillingly practical conclusion to a relationship built on the fragile foundation of vanity and the pursuit of unearned luxury. I officially stepped into the role of chairperson of the board later that morning, immediately initiating a comprehensive restructuring process to stabilize our financial systems. My first priority was to address the immense debt burden Claude had incurred, using the capital from my private funds to restore the company's liquidity and protect the livelihoods of our thousands of employees. We began a series of transparent audits to root out the remnants of Claude's mismanagement, ensuring that every department was now operating under a strict code of ethical and fiscal responsibility. The boardroom, once a place of ego and high-stakes gambling, was transformed into a center of strategic growth, where merit and integrity were the only currencies that carried any value. I felt a profound sense of purpose as I signed the new corporate bylaws, knowing that I was finally building a legacy that our ancestors would have been proud to call their own. The emotional ties to my former life were permanently severed during a final brief meeting with my father, who had attempted to initiate a reconciliation after seeing the extent of my success. He spoke about the importance of family unity and asked me to show mercy to Claude, yet his words carried no weight because they were born from convenience rather than genuine remorse. I calmly refused every one of his requests, pointing out that his blind favoritism had been the primary catalyst for the destruction that Claude had almost unleashed upon us all. There was no anger in my voice, only the absolute clarity of a woman who had finally recognized her own worth and refused to allow it to be diminished by those who had once cast her aside. I informed him that while I would ensure he had a comfortable retirement, his influence over the corporation and my personal life had officially ended with the signing of the Obsidian Agreements. Claude's professional demise was followed by a series of federal investigations into his fraudulent activities, including charges of embezzlement and multiple violations of American securities management regulations. The paper trail Quinn and I had meticulously gathered was delivered to the proper authorities, ensuring that Claude would be held legally accountable for the funds he had diverted to cover his gambling debts. He was no longer a player in the world of high finance, but a cautionary tale often discussed in the very boardrooms where he had once tried to assert his dominance. His public image was entirely decimated, leaving him to navigate a future of legal battles and financial ruin that was a direct result of his own unchecked arrogance. I chose not to follow the bankruptcy proceedings as I had already moved toward a future where Claude's name was merely a footnote in a larger story of reclamation and success. In the final phase of my transition, I established a permanent foundation specifically designed to provide capital and legal support for talented women who were being held back by domestic or familial financial abuse. I named the organization in honor of the ancestors who had originally built our family's wealth, ensuring that my victory would serve as a catalyst for genuine community value rather than just a private act of revenge. This foundation became my true legacy, offering a path to freedom for those who were currently trapped in the same shadows I had inhabited for so many years. I stood in my new office looking out at the city skyline with a quiet sense of absolute freedom, knowing that I had not only survived my brother's betrayal, but had weaponized it to build something meaningful. The penniless sister who had been mocked in the courtroom was gone, replaced by a woman who had claimed the board taken the king and walked away entirely untouchable. This story is produced by the channel for educational purposes, aiming to convey a strong message about the importance of setting personal boundaries and handling life crises through rationality and the law. We believe that true power lies in one's ability to remain calm and decisive during times of betrayal. Irene's decision to cut all ties was a necessary act of self-preservation that demonstrates the strength required to protect one's self-worth from toxic family dynamics. The antagonists in this story suffered the inevitable consequences of their own choices, proving that greed and arrogance will eventually lead to a total professional and personal collapse. The power of strategic silence. Quietness should never be mistaken for weakness. Irene proved that the most effective counterattack is planned in the shadows where patience and intellect outmaneuver the loud arrogance of those who believe they are untouchable. Rationality over emotion. Success in the face of betrayal requires a disciplined legal and financial approach. By decoupling her emotions from her brother's failure, Irene was able to maintain the clarity needed to seize control and protect the family legacy. Upholding personal boundaries. True dignity comes from the refusal to tolerate disrespect even from blood relatives. Setting firm boundaries is not just about protection, but about creating the space necessary to build a life founded on integrity and self-respect. We sincerely thank all the viewers who have patiently listened to the very end of Irene's journey. Your support means everything to us as we strive to share stories of resilience. What would you have done if you were in Irene's position? Please share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your perspective on how to handle family betrayal.